But Rowan, I hear you ask, how is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy a hidden gem? It's an extremely famous piece of sci-fi satire from one of the most well-respected sci-fi authors. And that's absolutely true. However, in classifying many of the hidden gems of this series, I often try to approach it from an outsider's perspective. What would a randomer on the street know as opposed to a dedicated sci-fi enthusiast? Which is why I think it's unfortunate that many people these days will be most familiar with the 2005 film adaptation. While it's overall well made, it's frankly an awful adaptation of such a fantastically clever and funny story. Which is why specifically in this video, I wanted to highlight the 1981 TV adaptation as today's hidden gem. For those unfamiliar, the titular book is a fictional encyclopedia of all lifeforms, planets, and phenomena throughout the known universe. One of the curators is Ford Prefect, an unlikely friend of the hapless Arthur Dent, who begins the story frustrated as his house, and indeed the Earth, is about to be destroyed. Soon after, Dent is pulled into a satirical space adventure which reveals the absurd origins of all creation. The story was conjured up by author Douglas Adams when, intoxicated thanks to a variety of substances, legal and otherwise, passed out in a field on his way home and essentially dreamt the concept into existence. No, seriously. It began as a BBC radio play which was eventually adapted into its most popular form, a novel series, known as a trilogy in 5 parts. From there it has gone on to be adapted into the TV show Be Getting Stuck Into, comic books, a video game, stage plays, and the aforementioned movie. It's an incredibly acclaimed and inspirational work. Its fingerprints are all over shows like Red Dwarf, Rick and Morty, and apparently Elon Musk insists on copies of the book being placed inside all SpaceX passenger capsules, which is on the sensible side of notable things he's done. What makes Hitchhiker so appealing as a story though is its wry wit and sense of absurd humour. Whereas other writers such as H.P. Lovecraft draw from existentialism, the idea of just how small and insignificant humanity is for the purposes of horror, Douglas Adams draws from existentialism for comedy. On the whole, much of Hitchhikers depicts small people and small organizations trying to make sense of the big questions with hilariously bizarre results. The various attempts of humans and aliens alike to make sense of the vast and noble universe and whatever may or may not have created it has resulted in an endless string of truly baffling events and actions. However, what truly drives this sense of humour is the story being told from the perspective of the book itself. While we follow Arthur Dent and the characters around him, the plot itself is narrated by the guide, and by its own admission is often inaccurate and apocryphal. This alien perspective on much of human existence, and existence in general, conjures some of the most memorable gags of the series. It uses an earnestly mistaken perspective to throw truly bizarre elements of human life, which we accept for granted, into sharp focus. And similarly with Star Trek, the various alien individuals and societies are used to examine other human traits and beliefs. It's this perspective and philosophical stance which adds so much depth to Hitchhikers as a story, making it one of the funniest and most profound sci-fi works worth reading. Now that we're up to speed, I want to get into why, amidst all the various versions, spin-offs and inspired works, the 1981 TV series is easily the best version outside of the novels. As opposed to my usual structure in which I break down presentation, characters, etc., here's a bunch of simply really terrific things about the TV show. It has a pretty similar aesthetic to classic Doctor Who of the time, although this show comes off a little better as the filmmakers only had to make 6 episodes instead of the usual 23 made for seasons of Doctor Who at the time. But despite this, the production values still end up giving off an inherent cheapness and quaintness. But while this can sometimes be a little off-putting in Doctor Who, which is trying to render a lived-in, authentic sci-fi world, the rougher production values of Hitchhikers actually ends up working in its favour. Oftentimes, the concepts and ideas featured in the story are so absurd and outlandish, they're only aided by their DIY-looking appearance. The whole aesthetic ends up actually becoming quite charming. One aspect of the show, however, which does stand head and shoulders above standard TV fare of the time, are the animated segments in which the guide is explaining something. These segments were painstakingly hand-animated by about 2 or 3 people working out of a spare room at the BBC. There's no computer graphics here. This is essentially the same thing as traditional 2D cell animation. And considering how intricate many of these shots are and how quickly information is conveyed to the viewers, that makes this an incredibly impressive achievement. And while the visuals impress, it's the narration which gives them their life. The voice of the guide itself is Peter Jones. Originally the producers wanted a recognisable voice for the book like a Richard Burton, but instead, quote-unquote, settled for the lesser known but highly distinct Peter Jones. While a voice like Burton is iconic, Jones is the voice of the guide in my mind. It's not so much the tone of his voice, but its character. As mentioned earlier, the guide itself is famously inaccurate in universe, so while Peter Jones is extremely comfortable with long narration, he also sounds completely sincere when he's confused about a human custom the guide has misunderstood. Rather than some cynical, dry dump of exposition, Peter Jones has the guide convey information like a parent telling a bedtime story. It is truly wonderful and a sign of the next great thing I want to highlight, namely the cast. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy TV series is one of the best cast shows you'll ever see. Several cast members were in fact brought over from the original radio play Douglas Adams had written. Thus, Simon Jones was the embodiment of Arthur Dent even before the novels were written. He's the perfect encapsulation of the stereotypical mild-mannered meek British homesteader. All he really wants is to find a good cup of tea and do his best to return to his old, comfortable habits. This character would be a total brick if it wasn't for the witty dialogue and Jones's innate innocence and likability. He's like a nondescript stock human being for the story, but in a good way. Meanwhile, David Dixon is basically one of the best doctors Doctor Who never had. His Ford Prefect is a quick-thinking, clever traveller, but also cynical and has no time for idiots. Unlike Arthur Dent, who is content to roam through life reading the paper and sipping tea, Ford Prefect fully grasps the scale of the adventure he's on and delights at seeing all the crazy shit he encounters along the way. Sandra Dixon is ripped right out of a pulp sci-fi adventure flick with a ditzy persona, but highly intelligent, and Dixon is a dab hand at some of the show's most memorable lines. Alongside her, Mark Wing Davey as Zaphod Beeblebrox radiates a unique charm. He's cool and charming, but in a kind of blokey way, like someone going through a midlife crisis, but instead of buying a flashy sports car, he nicked the fastest ship in the universe. In general, the show was just really funny.
Ford? There's an infinite number of monkeys out here who want to talk to us about this script for Hamlet they've worked out.
One day, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change.
We'll be saying a big hello to all intelligent life forms everywhere, and to everyone else out there, the secret is to bang the rocks together, guys.
Men were real men, women were real women, and small furry creatures from Alpha Centauri were real small furry creatures from Alpha Centauri.
It totally captures the wit and playfulness of Douglas Adams' writing, which makes sense considering he was one of the producers. But much like Red Dwarf, he uses the sci-fi setting and its outlandish concepts to mine for smarter and more surprising jokes and scenarios. And I suppose to round out this segment, I have to give a shout out to the excellent theme tune Journey to the Sorcerer, composed by the Eagles. It's a true crime I didn't mention it in my best sci-fi TV show theme tunes list I did a while back. As I mentioned before, it's likely the current generation, if familiar with any adaptation of Hitchhikers, will most likely be familiar with the 2005 movie adaptation directed by Garth Jennings. Now, it's not a bad movie, in fact it's pretty entertaining to watch and does have a lot going for it. The production design and VFX are wonderful across the board, and the cast do a great job. Martin Freeman is perfect as Arthur Dent, and Sam Rockwell is always a highlight in any movie he's in. However, it's pretty clear from a writing standpoint, this movie doesn't really get Hitchhikers. It feels like some Hollywood producers tried to alter it in an attempt to have it resemble a more traditional space adventure story. The Vogons become principal villains instead of one-off unpleasant bureaucrats. There's a conventional love story between Arthur and Trillian, and there's a lot more quirkiness to it. Stuff like Zaphod's lemon juicer brain helmet and the fly swatters feel like they're just there to be quirky, but they're not that clever. The animation for the guide segments is also a big letdown. The colour scheme is a bit dull and there's an odd amount of empty space. In the TV show, these segments were full of colour and motion and there were dozens of hidden jokes within each page. But here, they almost feel like an afterthought and not very well integrated into the movie. But easily the biggest misstep is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Now, major spoilers if you don't know the ending of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Seriously. So, eons ago, the supercomputer Deep Thought revealed the answer to life, the universe, and everything was 42. Confusing everyone, it went on to explain that while that is the answer, no one really defined what the question was. So Deep Thought built another supercomputer, the Earth itself, to find out what the question was. And despite the premature destruction of the Earth, Ford and Arthur are able to figure out that the ultimate question is 6 times 9. Which, even if maths isn't your strong suit, it's definitely not mine, you know it doesn't actually equal 42. Which is why...
I always said there was something fundamentally wrong with the universe.
It's the ultimate, completely ridiculous punchline to the best joke of the story, and the movie doesn't even include it. We sort of set off in that direction, but the film cuts off too early. It's likely they were going to reveal this in a sequel, but it never happened, so we're stuck with this sort of unfinished version. Honestly, I don't think The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy needs multiple movies or multiple seasons of a show to get to its point. Sure, there's a lot of material in the novels and in the radio play which didn't make it to the show, but it still managed to capture many of the best ideas and nail its ultimate theme. I've heard of Hulu's new TV show adaptation, and its rumoured early renewal for a second season doesn't actually make me all that excited, because in 1981, on a shoestring budget led by a great cast, this adaptation fully delivered The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and its cosmic weirdness in a single season, which is shorter in runtime than these movies. If you're not familiar with this great work, have only watched the movie or only read the novels, I implore you to track down this excellent series. Your mind will love you for the rest of your life. Irving Craig asks, who are some of your favourite villains from sci-fi movies and TV shows? Oof, that's a tough one. Obviously everyone knows Khan is great, but I think for a movie I'll give a shout out to Agent Smith from the Matrix films. Hugo Weaving is simply brilliant in those movies, even when he's really hamming it up in the third one. For TV, however, I'll say Gul Dukat from Deep Space Nine. Such a wonderfully rich character and probably the best villain in all of Star Trek as far as I'm concerned. Thanks for watching. If you like what I do and want to see more videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on all my new uploads. If you like what I do and want to help the channel grow, join me over on my Patreon where you can see videos like this early. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.